leave new build properties for its own topic because that can get very complex. But there are definitely a lot of costs that you need to consider and budget for. And it's different for each transaction. So, consult with your realtor, consult with your lawyer, and really get a sense of the money that you'll need to have for closing. And if it's within your budget, if your mortgage will cover it, if you have enough of a down payment, things like that. It's
So
something you want to work out as early as possible.
okay, got it. So what is your competitive advantage? Is there a competitive advantage based on different lawyers? So my question is, I am a first-time home buyer. Why should I choose Matthew Ram or MSM Legal to handle my portfolio? I know why I tell clients to go to you because you're such a respectable firm. But if no one's heard of you and their parents are telling them to go with
Yeah.
Uncle Sam or Uncle John,
Yeah, the family
why would
law.
they choose you?
Yeah, okay. So there's a number of things. One, our prices are fairly competitive, and that's because we do such high volume. And then also because of the way our process is, which isn't typical for most real estate law firms. Just to give you an example, to give some of the viewers some hard numbers, for a purchase of a property of less than $900,000, we charge $650 in legal fees. So that's a fee for our time. And in addition to that, you have HST on those fees, and then you have something called disbursements.
Okay.
So disbursements are all of the out-of-pocket expenses that we pay for work on the file. And they include such things as title searches, writ searches, tax certificates, any bank fees for transferring the funds from the mortgage, couriers, things like that. So in a typical transaction with the legal fee of $650 plus the HST and then the disbursements, it typically comes out to about $1,500 in total for a purchase of a property under $900,000.
Yeah,
right?
Which makes sense because that's very competitive compared to other law
Yeah.
firms.
And then, well, for us, we include a number of other services within that same fee.
Okay.
So one of the, prior to COVID, we were doing something called mobile signing, where
Yeah.
typically we would go out to clients, evenings, weekends, whenever it's convenient for them. I myself, as a lawyer, come out, sign documents, making it more convenient. That's all included in that $1,500, estimate. We also have, especially for first-time home buyers, we have something called a moving concierge service.
Okay.
It's essentially MoveSnap, if you're familiar with that. Just kind of tailored, I guess, for our process. But it allows first-time home buyers or any purchaser to coordinate new utilities or transfer utilities or facilitate new utility connections, coordinate home services. So like cable, internet, phone. You can coordinate movers, you can update your driver's license, forward mail, all of that type of stuff. So it's very useful for first-time home buyers who don't know that all this may be involved in the process, and it's all kind of click and go through an online portal. Right.
So that's the problem. So when I deal with a first-time home buyer, I give them a first-time home buyer's package with all of this information, but it's information overload. So by the time they get to you, it's too much. Like they don't even remember half of the things that I said about utilities or key drop-off or key pickup.
Yeah.
Or bill changes. Even a lot of first-time home buyers forget their condo fees come out of the first of the month. So it's good that you guys have that.
Yeah, it's understandable too. I mean, it's a lot to keep track of, especially if you've never gone through the process before. So when choosing a lawyer, like price point is one thing. I always tell people, you're always going to get what you pay for as well. But if you find someone who you feel comfortable working with who will kind of help you through the process, it'll make it so much easier for you.
Yeah, for sure, 100%. Now, someone else has just asked a question. For a first-time home buyer, what have you come across from a legal standpoint that you think, from a first-time home buyer's perspective, we should know or we should be aware of when buying our first property?
Okay, so let me think of things that I've run into. So one thing is, the main thing typically for first-time home buyers is they're not always fully aware of all of the costs and all the money that you need to have to provide on closing. including land transfer tax. Title insurance is something you're also going to have to get. Any balance of down payments, like that's probably the biggest thing that first time home buyers run into. Some of the other things are, it's in a very emotional process for especially for first time home buyers. That if there's something that comes up requiring a delay or something like that, they tend to take it a little bit harder and find it a little bit more difficult to deal with. But if they understand that this is something that can happen, you can better prepare for it. So for example, let's say you have a transaction closing on a Friday, which I typically don't advise, but let's say you have a transaction closing on a Friday.
Okay, why don't you advise that?
Because, through my example, you'll see why I advise against that. So let's say for whatever reason, your mortgage doesn't fund on that day. There's broker conditions outstanding. Maybe they're waiting for a updated letter of employment or something like that. Or maybe the seller is not ready to sell on that day because they're also purchasing something else, which has got delayed. Something causes delay on that Friday. Now you actually have to wait till Saturday, Sunday, Monday before you can close your transaction. As opposed to if your closing was on Thursday, then you would just move it to Friday, right? So for first-time home buyers, it can be an issue because now you have all your stuff packed up, ready to move, and you have to find somewhere to store for 3 days or 2 days at least, as opposed to 1 day. Okay. So things like that for some time home buyers can run into. But again, have a conversation with your realtor, with your lawyer. Any questions you have, just make sure you're prepared for whatever scenario may come up. Like for our clients, if I have any indication that we may not close on that day, I'll make them fully aware. And I'll try to help them prepare for that, because for me, I don't want to have to deal with negotiating this extension and dealing with all the lawyer stuff and then have to worry about the client not being able to find storage or have a place to stay. Yeah. Right. So we always try to make them as prepared as possible.
Yeah, that's true. That's absolutely. Thank you for that. Thank you for all of that information. Okay, so another question for you. What, and you just covered this, but I guess I can ask this again. What if there is an issue with closing at the last minute? For example, the lender does not fulfill the mortgage. What is your process outside of advising the client and hand-holding them through that scary time? What is your process and what gear do you go into from there?
Yeah, so a delay of closing or some sort of extension, it really depends on what's the triggering event. So like your example, if the mortgage doesn't fund, which does happen, there, just to kind of like backstep, first-time homebuyers need to understand that there are basically 2 steps to your mortgage. One where you provide everything to your mortgage broker and they satisfy their conditions, but then they send it to their back office who prepares registration instructions that has to get to my office. There's usually at least 2 or 3 days delay, usually about a week delay before that happens. So sometimes clients will think that once they sign in the bank, the next day I have instructions and ready to close. It doesn't work like that. So that's one reason. So if you sign your documents in the bank, 2 days before closing, likely going to need an extension because I won't get instructions by the closing date. So if it's my client as a purchaser who's triggered the extension, the need for an extension, then, I'll engage in negotiation with the other lawyer. Typically it involves some sort of cost on the triggering party, I guess. So if it's my client as a purchaser, they may have to pay additional legal fees to the selling lawyer to extend the closing. They may have to pay additional per diem on the mortgage for the seller that would have been paid on that day, but now they have to pay an additional 3-4 days of interest. So all of that will be passed down to my client as a purchaser. What they may also ask for is additional deposit, just to make sure that the purchaser, my client, the purchaser, still intends to close this transaction. They may say we need another $1,000, $5,000 additional deposit. So the biggest thing with extensions is the additional cost.
Okay.
Right?
Per day, basically.
Per day. There could be some fixed costs, like if the sellers have to store or the other party has to store anything, they may charge you that. certain things. It's really specific to that particular transaction, but just make sure as a client, as a purchaser or the seller, that you're just aware of all the costs involved with that extension.
Okay, perfect. Now, just to pivot to the timeline, can I start with my timeline on my process? I will then throw it over to you, and you let me know
Sure.
what your timeline is and how this process works. So the
Sure.
client comes to me, Sinead, I would like to buy this condo. So I say, okay, let's go look. Go look at the condo. We put in an offer. We get the deposit. We send over the status certificate to you. You review it. And then the offer gets accepted. We submit the offer over to, I guess, the listing agent, drop off the deposit to them. Everything's good to go. Next step, we come over to you and we give you the entire offer. I send it over to your office. What happens then? At what point does the client engage with you? What is your timeline? And let's say we're looking at a month closing.
Okay, so in that particular situation, the client will probably engage with me at the time that you receive the status certificate and then send it to me,
Okay.
right? And what that means for first-time homebuyers is when you're buying a condo, there's a status certificate that outlines everything that the condominium corporation, so the corporation running that condominium, everything, it's a status report on them. So anything, any court orders they may have, any common expense arrears on that particular unit, any engineering reports for deficiencies in the building, things like that. So at that time, I'll review it with the client, advise them, and they'll decide whether they want to continue or not. So let's assume they continue, you present the offer is accepted, then it gets to me. So we send out an initial email to the client. Well, one, I'll have a phone consultation with them, kind of go through the transaction, break down legal fees. Then we send an initial email to the client where we kind of gather preliminary information and IDs, and then we start work on the file. And we'll be in contact with them throughout working on the file. One thing we'll tell clients as soon as we start working on the file is to finalize your mortgage.
Okay.
Because as I was describing earlier, if that's left too late in the process, you run a risk of delay.
Oh.
Now, I need mortgage instructions, ideally at least 2 weeks before the closing date.
Okay.
Because once I get it from the bank, I then have to prepare their documents for the client to sign, need another day, and then I have to meet with the clients to sign. Depending on scheduling, that could take a few days or it could be the next day, depending. So the sooner we have that stuff, the better.
Okay, perfect.
Now, yeah, so now once I have your mortgage instructions, prepared all the documents, I meet with you to sign. Once we sign all the documents, now we get to the closing day. And then I can kind of go through the closing day process as we're talking about it. So basically on closing, if you're a purchaser, first I'll receive in the morning mortgage funds from your bank. Let's say it's TD. So TD will put in my trust account your mortgage funds. I'll have the balance of the money that I need from you. So the balance of your down payment prior to that date. So now I have all the money I need to close this transaction. So the money gets transferred to the selling lawyer. They send over keys. There's an exchange of documents. Both lawyers review the documents one more time, and then it gets registered.
Okay.
So your property could register anywhere between, I would say, like 12 p.m. and 5 p.m. on that day. The latest it could be is 5 p.m. because land registry closes at 5 p.m.
Okay.
Now, one thing that purchasers should be aware of is even though I may give you your keys at 12 p.m. on that day, you have to allow the sellers until 6 p.m. to actually leave the property.
Okay.
Right? So if you're scheduling moving and stuff like that, I wouldn't schedule it for the morning just because you still have to allow the sellers time to move out, clean, and do whatever they need to do.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, that's really good information.
Yeah.
Now, for first-time home buyers who are foreign buyers,
Yes.
what is the timeline? Is it a similar timeline that they look to, or do you need more time to work with them?
Okay, so typically it is the same timeline. The only additional step there is the non-resident speculation tax.
Yes.
So we do need time. Again, 2 weeks is ideal. If I have to, I can do it in shorter, but ideally allow yourself 2 weeks to allow me to make that calculation, prepare the documents, and send it into land registry to make that payment. The That speculation tax for non-residents applies to anybody who is not a Canadian citizen or permanent resident. And it's on the full purchase price of the property, 15%.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Now, how can buyers process gift receipts?
What do you mean by gift receipts? Like it's a gift from another person, like a gift deed?
A gift deed, or it's a lender asking this question, so I'll ask to clarify.
Okay.
She's on the call, so she's
Okay.
clarify. In the meantime, I guess, what are some incentives? Okay. While she's sending me that message, another question is, what are some incentives first-time homebuyers can look forward to that you commonly get asked about? Because I say it right up front to them, you know, first-time homebuyers, rebate, all that good stuff, but sure you get asked the same question I get asked. So
Yeah. So for first-time home buyers, it's the land transfer tax rebate is the main incentive. You know, there's the RRSP as well we talked about, but the main one on my end is the land transfer tax rebate. Now, this is something that we should talk about because the requirements are not really clear to people typically. So one, you have to be over the age of 18. Two, you have to be a Canadian citizen or permanent resident. Three, you have to have not owned a property in Canada. And four, well, sorry, three, not own the property within Canada or anywhere in the world. Okay, so if you moved here from the US, you had a property in the US, and now you're buying your first home in Canada, you do not qualify.
oh, yeah.
That's one thing people don't consider.
Or if their name is on the deed in the US.
Correct.
Wherever in the world.
Right, because that means that you've held an interest in real estate or in that property wherever else in the world. So you're no longer eligible as a first-time home buyer.
And they would have to disclose that to you.
They would. It's part of in that initial email I mentioned, it's part of the questionnaire that we ask. Now, the last thing is, and this affects first-time home buyers because typically you buy a house once you get married. So if your spouse has owned the property anywhere in the world previously or used their first-time home buyer rebate, then you may not be eligible to use your first-time home buyer rebate.
Okay. Speaking of spouse, I had a question for you. I mean, this is probably a question a lot of people are wondering right now. So let's say that you live with your spouse, right? Yeah. Just give you a scenario here. You live with your spouse and their name is on the deed. They are the homeowner. You decide that you want to go through with a divorce right now. How does that work for you as a first-time home buyer?
Okay, so in this scenario, my clients are the owners of the property, or they're buying the property that's where the divorce.
So they're first-time home buyers. They've never owned before. But their partner is a homeowner, but they live with their partner, right? And now they're in the process of getting divorced and they want to purchase their first home.
Yeah. So unfortunately, well, for this land transfer tax rebate anyways, you're not eligible because once you've lived in a property where your spouse has used their first-time home buyer benefit already, so you get married, you move into your wife's house that she's already had, let's say, you've deemed to have benefited already from the rebate, right? So even if you divorce now and then you go to buy your first property within your name, you're not eligible.
Sorry guys. And what about common law?
Okay, so common law, that rule does not apply. So the difference in a very basic sense between common law and marriage is entitlement to property rights.
Ooh, that's
right. So let's say, for example, if you're married and you divorce, regardless if your name is on title for that property or not, you're entitled to your spousal share within that property.
Yeah.
If you're common law and you split or break up and you decide to move out of the house, you are not automatically entitled to anything within that property. You know, if you can show that you've contributed this much, you paid for some renovation, then contractually or legally you may be able to argue that you're entitled to this much, but there's no family law act deemed entitlement.
Be careful, Matthew. You're going to make a lot of people not want to get married.
Yeah, yeah.
If a client receives part of their down payment, if it's gifted from their family member, what is the process of issuing a gift receipt, and how can they get the gift receipts to provide it to the lender?
Okay, perfect. So yeah, so I get what they're asking now. So essentially, if that gift's being done, you can get basically a gift deed or a letter from a lawyer saying that it's the intention of the donor, the gifter, to gift whatever portion of money towards the other party, the beneficiary, and then that way that's all formalized and legal, and then that's provided to the lender. It can be in form of affidavit. Usually the lender will let us know what they're looking for to satisfy that requirement. So it's usually typically an affidavit or a gift deed. Pretty simple to do.
This is one that I get a lot. So I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but I do get asked this.
Yeah.
I bought a scenario. I bought a property with my parents, or I couldn't get the mortgage under my own name. So my mom or my dad puts their name on my mortgage, or my deed. It's been 5-6 years now. I'm ready to take them off. How easy is the process, and do I have to requalify for a new mortgage in order to remove them from the deed?
Yeah, so you're right. That is fairly common, especially with first-time home buyers. So there's a couple things that I would suggest here. One, typically what we do is we will put the parents on for 1% ownership on the property, or a very minimal percentage of ownership, just to maximize that first-time home buyer rebate or any other benefit that will come from the client being a first-time home buyer. So that's one thing. Now, two, when you go to remove them later on, you will have to refinance your mortgage, because whatever names are registered on the deed have to be registered on the mortgage. And if you think about it from the bank's perspective, if they're going to remove somebody from title of the property, meaning they've removed them from liability on the mortgage, they got to make sure that you're able to carry that mortgage.
Exactly. Yeah.
You have to go through the whole underwriting process again, and then the mortgage is re-registered in your name alone, as opposed to registered with you and your parents. So that process, you typically start with your mortgage broker to see, based on your ratios and income, can you sustain a mortgage on your own now? And if you can, they work on preparing that, and then it'll come to me where I do what's called the title transfer. So we transfer your parents off title, and then we re-register the new deed in your name and the new mortgage in your name.
Okay. All right. That's great information. So to wrap this up, because it was such an amazing call, do you have any final thoughts for me, or anything that's common that you see on your end that you would like to bring or to our attention, or dispel any myths?
For first-time home buyers, I know it's a lot of information, but I think the more information they have, the better, because it's not as simple. It's not like going to a store and buying a t-shirt. It's a very complex transaction. There's a lot of legal aspects that they should be aware of, even before it gets to a lawyer, like even on your end, right? That whole agreement of purchase and sale will guide their entire transaction. So there's certain things in there, like let's say a hot water tank, right? If it's a rental and it's not listed in the APS, it may be presumed that the seller is going to pay for it out, that contract in full, or it may be that the purchasers have to pay for it. It really depends, right? So the more information they have, the more professionals they consult with, I think the better. And ultimately, it may seem like, you're adding on to your cost, but it ultimately may actually save you money in the end.
Yeah, it will. If you do it right the first time, you won't have to pay to do it
exactly.
the second time. And
Right.
that's the rule of thumb in real estate. So thank you so much for your time today. So we'll be back again together next week to ask all questions, a good Q&A question for first-time home sellers or sellers in general. So it's not just specifically for first-time home sellers. It will be for all sellers. Specifically in this market, I think it would be good to let them know set the expectation of what's happening next and what we are able to offer as real estate professionals.
Yeah, that's a great topic. Actually, I think there's not a lot of information for sellers specifically, so that's a great topic.
Yeah. No, there's not even like guides out there for first time home sellers. So
Yeah,
yeah.
that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, looking forward to it.
Okay, thank you so much. So I'll see you next week.
Okay, great.
Okay, bye. Bye everybody. Thanks for tuning in.
Bye, everyone.